Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Overall, we had another good week of reading responses. And I'm going to spend a little time on areas where people struggled. And I'm going to jump into the reading for this week. And so about half of you got the central argument of Bailey's book right. I want to point out where she offers really kind of the main arguments. We talked about red flags that we look for, right? And so Bailey, just like the last two authors we've read, gives us a red flag for one of her big arguments when she says that this book argues, right here. Like, just know if you didn't get this correct, you didn't identify that particular argument, you're behind a little bit right now, right? This is a kind of a simple skill set that only requires you to read carefully in the introduction or preface or prologue. And it's going to get more difficult here this week because the author isn't going to give us that red flag of I argue or this book argues. So I want to spend a minute on this because it'll be even more important when you start writing your own research paper, right? And so, this was a typical response from students who didn't get the argument correct. So here's an example. Something like, Bailey's central argument deals with the problems the Army faced with transitioning to an all-volunteer force while fighting in Vietnam. Another typical response began with, Bailey details, and then went on to summarize. And so words like deal with and details should never be in a sentence where you state the argument. These are words that lead to a description of what the author covers in the book. Right? And so they lead to description, not argument. And you need to keep this in mind, not only when telling me what the author's argument is, but also keep this in mind when you craft your own argument, when you write your own paper. The purpose is not to describe what's in the paper, it's to make a claim that you support with evidence. Right. So again, when you write your thesis, the purpose is not to describe what's in the paper, it's to make a claim that you support with evidence. And so in this week's reading response, I also challenged you to find an example of social history and cultural history in the book. Overall, you did a great job identifying social history. So remember, that one of the key fundamental assumptions of social history is that identity matters. When we're studying U.S. history, not all Americans experience the world in the same way. Your race, class, gender, and sexual identity, just to name a few, can help explain a person's experience. And most of you did a great job pointing out a moment in the book where Bailey writes about maybe how race or gender or class impacted soldiers' experience. And some of you went a step further and talked about how those identities shape power relationships. So really well done there. More of you struggled with cultural history, which is fine. I gave everyone points for the effort. Cultural history can be the most difficult to understand. And so remember last week we defined cultural history as concerned with meaning and interpretation. And some examples from America's Army that uses cultural history is examples where officials gave meaning to the Army, right? For example, when Bailey examines how officials gave new meaning to the Army as a social good, she's using cultural history. When she examines how officials portrayed women as incapable of combat duties, right? She's using cultural history because she's studying how those officials gave meaning to and interpreted women's capabilities. When Bailey examines Army officials who are making conclusions about the fitness of black soldiers based on tests, she's using cultural history to study the meaning Army officials are giving to black soldiers' capabilities. And so you can see here that social and cultural history can work together, but remember that cultural history looks at the moments that people are offering interpretations or meaning, right? And that could be an interpretation of an event or a group of people or organization. It could be an interpretation of something very abstract, such as what democracy or inequality means. And so I'm hoping that you'll continue to start to see those sorts of methods in our next book on Walmart. For cultural history, pay attention to how people in the Walmart book start to change their understanding of corporations and whether they are good or bad for America, right? How they attach particular meaning to gender roles and what sorts of jobs and skills that men and women are capable of. In the book, they start to give new meaning to Christianity in order to make corporate capitalism and Christianity compatible. And so in studying those changing meanings and interpretations, we're engaging in cultural history. And so this week, I'm going to introduce one more skill set that will be necessary to complete your paper. And so I'm going to go down here for a second so I can put a note in. And so if you've ever taken an upper level history class before, you might have learned the term historiography. And I'm just going to write it in here so you can see what this looks like. My handwriting's really bad. And so some other fields call this a literature review. And basically, when a historian writes something, they have to tell other historians why it's worthwhile to read. And so one way we do this is by showing other historians what's been written about the topic you're writing about and how your work fits into what's been written before. And so you're going to do this on a much smaller scale in your own research paper. But we're going to study how this works in the book that we're reading for this week. And so usually historians will tell readers what their work adds to the field they're writing about. They might say that some people are wrong and their book is going to correct past arguments that are just off base. Some historians might suggest that other historians, that they're not going to suggest that other historians are wrong, but they might suggest that historians have missed something, whether it's an event or a person or a development that needs to be added to the field. And so when historians write about what they're adding to the field in their book, we call this a historiographical intervention. And so what I want to do is challenge you in the reading response for this week to try to identify the historiographical intervention in To Serve God and Walmart. And so just like when we try to identify the argument, there are usually red flags that we look for. And so in the prologue of the book, look for references like historians, historical scholarship, and scholars. Those are all red flags when you see those words, that the author is talking about how other people have written about the subject. And when authors are really nice, they will tell you when they're outlining their own intervention, right, or addition to the field by writing something like, this book offers another perspective, right? And so we're looking for the moment Morton tells us how her work is different from what's been written so far. So that's the big challenge, new challenge for this week in the reading responses. So do the best that you can. And then I'll talk about it in next week's video. And so as I'm sure you've noticed, this is the last book we're going to read before we get into the fun stuff, which is the research, your own research. And I've saved this book for last because it will be the most challenging. The argument won't be as obvious. You'll see the author uses some academic jargon that you might not be familiar with, but it's also a really valuable book that lets us study some of the big economic transformations of post-1945 U.S. history. So I hope you enjoy it. Remember that you can always email me with questions throughout the week.